By mainstream scholarship, the person that I'm about to play would be considered an Afrocentrist.
Now, continuing on from part 14, all right? Now, you will see that in ancient Egyptian, like we previously discussed, that the name for a house is Bait. And in Swahili, Baiti, okay, according to Farga Sherman, as well as, just general Swahili, a house is called Baiti, right? Now, guess what other language other than South Arabic, which is bite, and Arabic, which is bait. And now, this here is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and that's bait.
This is something that I've even talked about, the word sbaya being a word in Zulu, the word ba meaning house in Sudanic, bait meaning house in Arabic, and all of that. But I'm not really here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about Afrocentrism as it relates to people from Africa. Now, keep in mind the type of work that is being done here. So you can see it's written, my frustration with the Western body of knowledge over Middle nature. So this person is, by traditional terms, clearly an Afrocentrist. And I want to pause here. So if we clearly read this, Bantu languages and ancient Egyptian core vocabulary. I have followed Joseph Greenberg's method of mass comparison of vocabulary between ancient Egyptian and Bantu. It has come as a surprise that many sound meaning relationships between the languages are peculiarly of Bantu origin, and the etymologies and of lexical terms examined also present further evidence. The core vocabulary of ancient Egyptian words for tree, the eye, seeing, the sun, fire, heat, animals, terms, body parts, words for trees, water, name for rivers, lakes, canals, and important words. Now, I've pointed out some of these myself, but again, this is about Afrocentrism.
It's possible they won't get them all, and thank you. Hello, hello, hello. Bayito na bakwaniri mwensi momo busisi alitaria Yesu Kristo na bakwaniri. Biamore. So as I'm coming back again this time, I know I had promised to talk about Nebuchadnezzar, but then I had a change of heart because there was a pressing need to talk about this. So what I'm going to talk about is a difficult conversation. And sometimes when you're talking about difficult conversations, and when there's racial relations, no matter how much you try to paint it, it doesn't come out good, even if your intention is good.
Now, to be fair, this video that I'm playing is 8 years old. The person is still making new videos, and most of them are based around the ties between the Bantu language and ancient Egyptian. So I don't think she subscribed fully to this idea as she did in the past. But I want to show you the default, even in Africa, for the term Afrocentric.
Although my intention is not to spread any kind of segregationist ideology or anything like that, it's just to show you and to pay attention to, when you're performing another language. Now, I've been asked myriad of questions by many African people and non-African people. And many people ask me, do you think Mtunetoror or Mtuneta or, Mduneta, depending on how you pronounce it, has really been decoded? Well, I always say yes, in as far as the white man can understand it. Now, well, with exception to those that have been, decoded by African scholars. Now, of course, I'm a heavy, follower of Dr. Theophilo Benda and check Antatol.
Notice this part as well. A heavy follower of Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga.
And Dr. Chang. So anyway, I have always believe that the representation of Muntunetta is not African because the Western body of knowledge dominates, also known as Royal Bible Society and those who are behind this, the royal families, are the ones who own that body of knowledge of Muntunetta and much of the African languages. Now, this is the thing. Um, the first topic I want to talk about is just my whole frustration, and it's not just me, it's an opinion of many other Africans. It's just the whole frustration of the Western body of knowledge in teaching Mtuneta as if they were the absolute authorities of African language, you know. And then second is I'm going to talk about the representation of the performance of Mtuneta by the Afrocentric community. You know, I'm grateful that there is a representation by the Afrocentric community, but
So again, a rejection of Western scholarship, which I agree that starting from the Western point of view to some degree has too many flaws, and also an acknowledgement of Afrocentrists. Like again, I agree, and I think most scholars now who study African history agree that there was a core of reality within Afrocentric ways of looking at things because people did not realize their bias in the West. Have they gotten rid of it? Nope. But at least there are some who acknowledge that Afrocentric ideals were not wrong in their intuitiveness.
the representation of Mtuneta is still, whether it's done, you know, as long as it's being done by non-African people, is still non-African. Meaning that the Afrocentric knowledge there is, it seems to incline towards a Western body. It is a part of the Western body of knowledge.
Now, this is a little deep, but I think we have to go here so that we can understand something. See, one of the things about Afrocentrism, especially the one branded through America, which again, I don't agree with her that they should not be going through it. I'm just saying this is the perception of Afrocentrism is that for all its efforts, it's still a Western ideology. And because it was a pushback against Western ideals, it adopted Western ideals. If you use pure African history, if you use pure African knowledge, in a way, you will have to shed race. Race does not exist within Africa. I'll give you a very simple one again, which is you notice how she keeps saying Bantu, similarities with the Egyptians, but yet there are a lot of African Americans who want to deny that there's such a thing as Bantu and that that's some kind of racist term or whatever. But the word Bantu just means people in Africa and was used by the Europeans, but they didn't make it up, which is why there is this big misunderstanding. In Africa, we are so tied to our tribes that the word Bantu is so familiar to us that we do not reject it. But other people reject it because it was utilized by Europeans. So the pushback is Western. They see something that Westerns invented and then they push back from it. But we don't push back from it because we understand the context of the word. Western body of knowledge. My frustration with the Western body of knowledge is the teaching of Mother Nature, the Afrocentric
I
community, a branch
think
of
that the
Western.
expression of Mtuneta roar, or ancient Egyptian language has taken on a totally different life force. You know, one that is becoming a hybridized animal. Of course, we know how hybridization of animals and the West rhyme. Hello. Anyway, so it's taking on this totally different life force that is a jargon, you know, between the elitist white scholars, you know, uh, who have sociopolitical interests at heart in this, you know, this whole other movement or identity that is a disembodied you know, pseudo African expression of especially arrogant Afrocentrics.
Now, if I understand her, this is a another part of the history again. It has to do with the philosophy of learning. See, in Africa, even though there's such a thing as a master in learning, for the most part, that person is to aid the community. There's no such thing as I myself have become a master. You're doing it to aid the community. And so things like Nobel Prizes and things like that, there seems to be a problem. But again, this is an adoption of Western scholarism where you elite people who have great knowledge with the misunderstanding of the point of that knowledge in Africa. Again, I'm not talking about my personal ideals because, again, I don't just push back on Western scholarship for no reason. It has to be something I completely disagree with. But this is what I think she's getting at.
Because not all Afrocentrics are like that. But being who represent Africanness as whiteness, okay? Because if you speak English and English is your mother tongue, then, by default, then racism, white supremacy becomes mother and father. I've had very many, racist like comments, especially by not only white people but African Americans as well.
Okay, so first I thought I didn't understand what she was saying, but I think what she's trying to say is so a lot of us Africans have very different accents than people from America and places like that. And you will notice that a lot of us have to take abuse from both the black community and the white community when it comes to the speed that we talk by, the speed that we read, and also the way that we basically interpret things from our point of view, from the African point of view. Again, I'm just trying to interpret what she's saying. You guys know that I'd never go this deep into it. This is why I don't bother with the whole Afrocentric word. One of the things that we talk about is the fact that a lot of these people, they do not speak any African languages, which I recommend people to learn African languages, but then they like to compare African languages to ancient Egyptian, which, if you notice within the Indo European world, you must at least be able to speak one of the languages. For example, imagine if you didn't speak English or any Indo European language and you were trying to compare the Indo European languages for one from another, but you didn't speak any of them. This becomes a problem, which is why it's more fair in Africa where we understand Bantu. And then when someone gives us a context of an ancient Egyptian word, we are able to fully interpret it within our own culture. So let's take this immaterial experience. So, in other words, the experience that I get just by speaking the language. When I say immaterial, I mean non material, not irrelevant. But if you take it, the word tooth, right? You can see here the word tooth or tooth means to spit in most Afro Asiatic languages. This is easy for someone who can speak Bantu languages to related to a word from their own language. In mine, it's tufela, which means to spit. And you can see there it means to spit. As a verb, this word is, if you look straight at the bottom, you can see the quifa, and then you can see fela. This fela is from tufela. They just put the last part on there. Now, this does not mean that these words are necessarily related, but it is interesting to gather a lot of these words as I used to until I started realizing that I think it's going over a lot of people's heads. One of the things that I used to do was to show the word manzi, and all the other languages around Africa would utilize that word as well and its context, not just that the words look alike. But I think a lot of people, especially people who I saw repeating what I was saying, misunderstood and thought it's the fact that they look the same that I'm saying what I'm saying.
And this is how we as Africans look from the outside in. Who are you really as an expression of who an African should be? Even how to express and say, I discovered this language, I discovered the meaning. That's not an African form. It's I.
So she's going back to what I was saying earlier, the heightening of the individual within Western scholarship, making it a battleground rather than a place of open dialogue where you don't elitize specific people just because they arrived first to a conclusion. And like I said, personally, I have seen the similarities between words like manzi and other words all over the world that have, well, all over Africa that mean water. And I think it's a little more than just a coincidence. But at no point did I claim that I'm the person who discovered it. I know there's other people who know this information. If there weren't, I would be hesitant to put it out there as real information.
The ego. That's not even an African form of expression. So how can you possibly say you, by the epitome of the fact that you are, I don't know, this Egyptian name they give themselves, as the quintessence of the representation of what an African language is? You don't even understand yourself. How can you understand my people? My only problem is I have no problem with self-expression. Just be respectful and say, by virtue of the fact that I, as an African American scholar, that I, as a white scholar, speak English as my mother tongue, then I face the impending or imperative, you know, danger of mutilating the language by not only my perception but my expression.
Now, I want to talk about one of the earliest videos I made, which was this. It had this type of writing in it, and I follow a lot of these comments within the circles of African studies. And there's a few things that I noticed within African studies that weren't talked about until there was a certain introduction. And one of them is these similarities within words, which I've seen be practiced way more by African Afrocentrists, if you want to call them that. And it's because these words are so apparent to us when we see them. Like I said, in the Berber areas, the word Aman means water. Though in the Nilotic areas, the word Aman from Old Nubian means water. In Egypt, the word Ma, and in Arabic as well, Alma or Ma means water. And then Amanzi in basically most African or Bantu languages means water. Now, some people took this to mean that this is absolute, but really it's the context behind the words, not just the fact that they look the same. Now, remember that there's this ah in the beginning. This ah is a prefix. And this is what I really wanted to get at, that all of these African languages have prefixes. These prefixes are rare in languages in general, but common in Africa. But there's also another thing. See, Western scholarship did bring us this understanding that the words, the alphabet that come from the Phoenicians are related to the ancient Egyptians. This is something that is completely accepted by African Afrocentrists, if you want to call them that. And again, I'm fine with Afrocentric people calling me Afrocentrist because they have a completely different meaning of that word than outsiders. But if you go and look at that, that was completely deciphered by Westerners. And we do not sit back and go, oh no, because they deciphered it, we can't use it because it's annoying. That is actually one of the things that I've seen a lot of people push back on. And I have to stress that is non African to ignore, or let me use the word fagazi, which means evidence in Zulu, to ignore evidence because of who it came from is not African.
We're two totally different people. Even how we perceive things and how we perceive color. I do this video. I also want to express, disappointment. I want to say, I think I've only met two people who are interested in studying Mutunata. They're not even, scholars with degrees, but highly intelligent people. I think I've only met two who actually acknowledge the fact that Hebrewism is a part of Africans. So even as I talk about this, I tackle those Afrocentric scholars who I feel, because of their ignorance, have also denied some of those Africans of Hebrew descent their identity. And I'm not talking about segregationist, Hebrewism. Because I have a strong belief that, and based on the core vocabulary and comparisons, if you're using Hebrew to decode into Natural, then those languages were pretty similar, highly similar.
Again, this is a little too deep, but you can see here with the frustration that she's going against the segregation element. And of course, Hebrew is related to ancient Egyptian because it's part of the Afro-Asiatic branch, which for the first time when I mentioned the word Afro-Asiatic, I had a bunch of people push back against me and say, how can you say Afro-Asiatic? Isn't that like some Western made up thing? And the answer is no. Even if the Western scholars discovered that these languages are similar, firstly, they were not the first to discover it. I've shown you that Arab scholars, even those located in Africa, so Al Jahiz will be an example, Ibn Nawaz is an example, way before 1,000 years ago, discovered the similarities between Hebrew, Arabic, ancient Egyptian. These people are not Western scholars in the sense. In fact, they were ancient Egyptian scholars, or they were Egyptian scholars, and they happen to speak Coptic, Egyptian, Arabic, Hebrew, and several other languages. And in the sense of Dunawaz, he was Nilotic, so he also spoke Sudanic languages. And that's how they brought the similarities together. This fact that modern scholars from England had to rediscover is something that was known to Africans in Sudan, Arabia, Egypt, Hebrew land, I mean Israel, and so many other places around that central area of the world. So even the Swahili coasts. And then basically the person who a lot of Afrocentrists give credit to, Champollion, he went and copied a lot of this work. He was aware of this work.
But Natural is a Bantu language. So what is Hebrew then? You know, sometimes it looks like there's this band of scholars that come up with the idea of Hebrew as a Semitic language just so it fits that structure. But that's not believable to me if you're using a Semitic language to decode a language that is supposedly Bantu. Internet uses, the Internet uses agglutination just like Bantu languages. Very similar with African, structure in terms of, lexical terms. So the best way to go forward, especially in African Americans and Africans joining together as a cohesive force would be for, a majority of you to learn, you know, the African languages. It would be important. It would be imperative.
Okay, so I'm going to cut off the video over here because it's 1 hour long and I don't have time to sit and talk about this video for 1 hour. Instead, I have to look at another video done by, I don't know if the person's white or not, but an American who talks about Afrocentrism as well. And they talk about it in a, let's say, downing way, even though scholarship looks at the word Afrocentric in a neutral way, that it's capable of bringing out good information and bad information.